So now we can read.
Mm.
It's chapter 11, verses 23 through 29. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Did anyone notice sort of the continuity of this section with previous sections?
It's all about faith, having faith.
What about the people mentioned? Basically, so far, it has kind of a survey of the people of God.
Yeah.
It's, a little bit sketchy at the beginning. He does Cain, uh, he does Enoch, he does Noah, but then he does the patriarchs. So starting from Abraham, there's really a continuous line of succession, and it ends with Joseph. And then, so if we look at the end of Genesis, which is Genesis chapter 50, in verse 26, Joseph died. So Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then we have Joseph. And so then when we begin Exodus, we have uh, sort of a lapse. There, the description of the 11 sons of Joseph, of Jacob, rather. And then there are, um, then it says Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation, but the descendants of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. It's in chapter 1, verse 7 of Exodus. And then in verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and so begins the oppression of the Israelites.
Yeah.
So here we have, the formation of the people of God and the continuity of faith. So that, continuity and that history is really significant. And so we begin uh, our section for today on the faith of Moses. And so we begin the section by faith. Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So this isn't the faith of Moses at all. This is his parents. Why is that? I mean, why mention parents?
So he would be the one to have faith that God had a plan for him, despite the fact that the Pharaoh was killing all the um,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And
children. Yeah.
and what else
firstborn.
might he be saying there?
that they had faith in God,
Yeah.
whom they
Uh-huh.
couldn't even see.
Yeah.
They had,
What else?
well, they trusted that Moses was going to be saved.
Uh-huh. What else?
Something else?
And so did Mary and Joseph trusted that Jesus would be safe when they
Yeah.
fled.
But why mention Moses' parents instead of Moses?
Well, it showed their faith, which would be passed on to their, well,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
This is a lineage. Faith is
yeah,
passed on.
yeah,
Individuals are not free agents. I mean, that's exactly why infants are baptized. They're baptized into the faith of their family.
that makes
We're,
sense.
we like to pretend. I mean, that's part of the author's message here. He's focusing on the people of God, and this is consistent with it. And we tend to think we're all free agents, like I'm me and I can do whatever I want and I can do whatever I want. And isn't that all wonderful? But the reality is we're shaped by our families,
Yeah,
born into a tradition. And so the um, the author is saying that Moses' parents were people of faith. They had faith in God. They saved Moses, believing that he had a mission. He had some purpose. And that tradition was passed on to Moses. Does everybody know about Moses and Pharaoh? And actually, let's read it since it's in many ways revealing in our own day. I think we can skip around a little bit, but um, so Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war befalls us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the sons of Israel. So they made the sons of Israel serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they made them serve with rigor. So let's stop there a minute. Does that sound familiar at all? First of all, you note the contradiction. Does anyone note the contradiction?
well, if the king planned to deal shrewdly with them, then it's likely they would rebel.
Yeah,
Like,
but what's the contradiction of the king's position?
well, if they were numerous and powerful, they could have helped him. It's not to say that they would, until they started being impressed, obviously.
Yeah, but more kind of directly, he's afraid that they're going to escape,
Oh,
right? Why is he afraid they're going to escape? Because they do all the work,
yeah, okay.
right? And his solution is to kill the the,
Huh.
the firstborn male, which is going to lessen the population so that they're less able to do work. Okay, now, how is that relevant in our own day? Immigrants, and particularly illegal immigrants, do
Oh,
much of the work
sure,
that particularly
sure.
white people don't want to do.
I didn't
And
even see that connection. But
It's
you're
a,
right,
it's a
immigration,
major connection. And
yeah,
so white people don't want to do the work.
yeah.
And what is the kind of emerging, I would probably even call it a theology of many white Christians? It's replacement theory, right? They're trying to replace us. And so, there's a supposed crisis at the southern border. We want to keep them out. They're poisoning our blood. They're, doing all of these horrible things. And it's all contradictory and a lie. But the sad thing here is that particularly white Christians are the major proponents of it. They've assumed the role of Pharaoh, which is tragic.
And a lot of the immigrants are more immersed in our faith than people
That's
who are here.
that's also a major issue. Most
Yeah.
of the, especially immigrants from South and Central America and Mexico, are Catholic. And there's also a very heavy dose, although it's not stated explicitly, there's also a very heavy dose of anti-Catholicism, because at least a large proportion of evangelical Christians do not consider us Christian. So that's at play as well.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know why the white people would feel threatened, you know? The immigrants from the South are taking those jobs that the white or, the middle income people don't even want. Are they afraid that they're going to take those jobs? Is that the replacement they're for?
I mean, there's this belief that they're taking our jobs, but
Well,
the fact is,
it's
that that's not
not true.
happening. And I don't know, that we can always find a rational basis for hatred and bigotry. Some, sociologists, I think, have probably sort of attempted to, but in the end, I mean, this is sort of living in a dream world. Yeah, in an imaginary world. I mean, very much like, the belief that they're also all criminals. If we look at the actual statistics, illegal immigrants are the least likely portion of the population to commit crime. And why are they the least likely portion of the population? Because they'll get deported and they want to be here, which is why they're illegal immigrants. So therefore, you stay out of trouble. So, there's just this sort of nativist, we got here first, we're white people, I mean, this is our land, never mind that we stole it from Native Americans. But ignoring that fact that we ourselves are thieves, this is ours. And there's no, I don't think that there's really any rational basis or sociological explanation or whatever. I think, it's very much like, I mean, Exodus talks about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. But the reality is, if we look at kind of the history of interpretation of what it means that God has hardened Pharaoh's heart, so one view is that God has brought about all of these events because he made Pharaoh refuse to let the Israelites free, etc. But the prevailing interpretation is not that God himself, deterministically caused this, It's that God presented Pharaoh with a choice. Pharaoh could let God's people free, or he could not. And he had multiple opportunities to let God's people free. And each time he chose not to. So, confronted with a choice, Pharaoh chose to harden his heart. And he chose to harden his heart, particularly because it was to his advantage, because he was an oppressor, and the oppressed did much of the undesirable work. And so the hardening of the heart was his own choice. God presented him with a choice. He selected the bad choice. And I think that's true as well of us, and it's true of many Christians today. God presents us with the choice, and we choose to harden our hearts. And you know, the problem here is that much of that nativism, racism comes particularly from the white Christian church. That's where it's really, really predominant. Based on that that understanding of the Exodus and its kind of applicability on the fact that God sets his people free, you know, that eventually in the 60s and 70s gave rise to liberation theology, which isn't very popular in some circles, but remains popular in parts of Central and Latin America. Thais, did you have any experience with liberation theology?
Yep,
Yeah,
very popular
very
for a
popular.
while. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I remember for a time that's all that we knew about the faith.
Right.
Um,
Uh-huh.
like that's what the Catholic Church looked like for us. But yeah.
Hmm. Right. Very, very important.
You call that, what did you call that? And Thais' experience? Is that the depiction of the Catholic faith was predominantly white? Is that
No,
what
no,
you mean?
no. We were talking about liberation
Yeah.
theology. The liberation theology emerged with the work of, I don't remember his name, I think his last name was Gutierrez, who was, I think, a Mexican theologian, and then, was quickly elaborated, but it has, sort of really much more historic roots. But the basic belief of, or, tenet of liberation theology is God, above all, hears the cry of the oppressed, and that God will set his people free. And so liberation theology, and so remember in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and I mean, in many ways, you can still argue through today, there was an enormous amount of oppression in Latin and Central America. United Fruit Company, which is now called, what is it? I don't remember, literally owned large parts of Central America. And US troops did their bidding. Remember the revolution in Chile with Allende, which was very popular, was really brutally repressed, uh, again with U.S. aid and U.S. forces, along with the right wing militia, and just a murderous rampage. Uh, the in Nicaragua, the Sandinisti, um, who were communists, actively collaborated with the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church actively collaborated with the communists, and they had a great deal in common in attempting to improve the lives of Nicaraguans. And then we had the Contras and the murder of Archbishop Romero, brutal repression again. But we also had brutal repression throughout much of Latin and Central America, and right wing movements as in Bolsonaro and in Brazil are still very popular in some circles. Um, so within that backdrop, liberation theology emerged as first of all, a reminder that God does hear the cry of the oppressed. And that's a really, really important thing that we often forget about. We see sort of faith as individual. I have faith, but God hears the cry of the oppressed. And so that should raise, for us the kind of issue of, do we oppress people, and what is our relationship to the world around us? So first of all, that God hears the cry of the oppressed, but secondly, that God not only hears the cry of the oppressed, he acts when he hears the cry of the oppressed, so that God frees his people. And in many ways, that's foundational. So taking a Jewish Seder, how is this night? The Seder ceremony begins. How is this night different than every other night? This night that we're celebrating, how is it different than every other night? Well, this is the same night of the Exodus, of the Passover. This is the night that God saved his people, that the angel of death passed over and saved us, and then led us on the Exodus and set us free, brought us into the land overflowing with milk and honey. He did that in the past. He's doing it today. And the Seder ends with, I'll see you next year in Jerusalem. God will regather his people. God sets his people free. And so that's a fundamental theme, that God hears the cry of the oppressed. And a very powerful theme, I think, and a very hopeful theme. Did I mention that the Masoretic text only says that his mother hid him?
Mm.
No.
So it's from the Septuagint that the author draws his conclusion. Then also, Healy mentions Stephen's speech in Acts that results in his martyrdom. And part of it is, I think, interesting to read, because it suggests that the author and St. Luke or Stephen are drawing on fundamentally the same tradition and the same understanding about Moses. So it's Acts chapter 7, starting at 17. But as the time of the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt till there arose over Egypt another king who had not known Joseph. He dealt craftily with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants that they might not be kept alive. Expose is a Greek-Roman term in the period for parents simply putting out their children to die. This time Moses was born and was beautiful before God. So he was beautiful before God. And that's what the author really means when he says, it's various translated, Moses was beautiful, Moses was fair, he was goodly, he was well-pleasing. He was beautiful before God. And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. And when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his word and deed. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel, and then goes on. So beautiful before God. They're drawing really on the same Hellenistic tradition, which is interesting because Stephen is in Jerusalem, but he's clearly, that speech is the speech of a Hellenized Jew. Now, he says that they were not afraid of the king's edict. Why? How does he draw that conclusion? Maybe we should read Moses' birth and discovery by Pharaoh's daughter. That's Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took to wife a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a goodly child, and goodly, fair, beautiful, variously translated, she hid him 3 months. So this is after the edict that the firstborn should be killed. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the river's brink. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." So they were not afraid of the king's edict, but it doesn't say that at all. What it does say it is earlier. So Pharaoh has his decree, going back to chapter 1, verse 15. So the problem is that despite the edict, there aren't a sufficient number of Hebrew firstborn being killed, which displeases the Pharaoh. So in verse 15, then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? And let the male children live." Midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and are delivered before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. The same verb is used of fear and not of fearing God of the midwives here, and of not fearing Pharaoh in Hebrews. So the midwives become, sort of a model of not fearing Pharaoh, but fearing God, which is then applied to Moses' parents. Also, you notice the sort of cleverness of the midwives uh, as a sociological phenomenon among the oppressed. That's a very common thing, and so there's a really, really great history of um, slavery modifying white slave culture in a way that builds their faith and allows them to struggle for freedom. A book is called Roll, Jordan, Roll. Roll, Jordan, Roll, the world the slaves made. And then also, just sort of off the top of my head, when during the period of Taylorism, time work studies, where there was intense um, exploitation in the workplace in the 20s and 30s. Henry Ford, for example, besides being a fascist, was a Taylorist. Um, there were German sociologists who went to study workers and question them about work. And they responded with bizarre answers about how, so for example, a lathe worker would say how he's working at his lathe, he would enjoy reading Shakespeare, which is obviously absurd, but people wrote that down. And, and so if you read their research, it's filled with answers that are, consistent answers from workers that are obviously distorted because they're telling people, their interviewers, what they want to hear rather than the reality, because they don't want to expose the reality, because it's dangerous to do that. These people are already, trying to impinge on the way you work and the dignity of labor, and you don't want to give them more ammunition because they don't care. What you want to do is you want to try to present yourself as a human being like them, which will maybe make them think about what they're doing. So any questions about this? That really brief passage about Moses' parents is really rich in meaning. So then we move from Moses' parents to Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. So let's go back and see how the author has modified, or how dependent the author is on Exodus. So we had just read from Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, where Moses is adopted as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And then there's a gap. And in verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11, it reads, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man that did the wrong, why do you strike your fellow? He answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And we can stop there. Is that refusing to be the son of Pharaoh's daughter?
Well, that's partly correct, right? I mean, he killed that Egyptian.
Uh-huh,
That's kind of significant, I thought.
right.
I
Yeah.
also thought it was kind of ironic that the man that's going to put out the laws, the Ten Commandments, killed somebody and then said, "Thou shalt not kill." So it's kind of ironic, but I get it. I mean, he wasn't touched by God personally yet. I mean, and be aware of it yet. So
Right, and the law, the Ten Commandments hasn't been
it hasn't
Yeah.
been, yeah,
handed down yet. So
handed. I like that, handed down. Right?
Yeah.
he's not tracing a history, the history by which Pharaoh refused to be called Pharaoh's daughter.
Mhm.
He's drawing the conclusion, from the result. Obviously, he refused to be called Pharaoh's daughter because he defended Hebrew and he felt an affinity with his people. He says he rejected the fleeting pleasures of sin. What does that mean?
That he didn't want to be rich like his mother, like his adopted mother. He didn't want the luxuries of being that Pharaoh's sister's son.
Uh-huh. And what else?
Well, he wanted to be with his kinship people, with the Hebrews. He wanted to be with his true family.
Mm-hmm. How does that
People.
relate to fleeting pleasures of sin?
Oh, yeah, well, it doesn't really. Yeah.
Oh, it does. It does.
Oh,
It
it
does
does.
relate
Oh,
to
how
it. It
does it relate?
certainly does.
Let me think about that.
As the daughter of Pharaoh's, I mean, let me start over. Family relationships are very, very difficult. As the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he's an heir of Pharaoh. So he's a member of Pharaoh's court. He's, a ruling elite. So what about that?
Well, he probably saw idolatry. They weren't people of God. Idols.
Yeah, although
He
I
didn't.
don't,
He doesn't understand God yet, does he? At that point. So
Probably not.
he probably
I mean-
never even, worshipped the idols because he was just a warrior, wasn't he?
yeah, I mean, we can speculate. It depends on. Clearly, he was raised by his mother,
Mhm.
who nursed him, and so I mean, in at least in later periods, like so for the English aristocracy, it sort of axiomatic that the nursemaids of children have a much greater role, influence in raising them than their own families, their mothers and fathers, who tend to be relatively indifferent, cold, and uncaring. And so that may well be the case here. And so in that case, assuming his parents, to be people of faith, he may have known a great deal about God, about Yahweh. The fleeting pleasures of sin. So so here again, we tend to see sin as often individualistic, and it often, is individualistic. Like, I told a lie, I, did whatever. But sin also frequently involves a relationship. Right? So that what I failed to do thing often stems from a relationship, neglected, or a relationship stress that shouldn't have been, as in, I saw somebody being abused and I did nothing. I, listened to racist jokes and I just sat there. I didn't say anything. But that's a relationship. And here, the fleeting pleasures of sin isn't simply that Moses is in the court and is, wealthy, or has all of this stuff, or is living a decadent lifestyle, or any of that stuff, although that's part of it. But the reason that that's so bad is that it's done at the expense of the Hebrew slaves. So it's done through exploiting people. It's not that Pharaoh has earned anything or done anything to deserve anything. Pharaoh has used his power to make people do work, to make people do very hard work, to take advantage of them, and to enrich himself and to enrich the elite. So there's a power relationship at work here. And that is precisely the fleeting pleasures of sin. Because what happens when you stand before God in judgment? It's not merely that you were decadent, it's that you oppressed people. You're an oppressor. How can you? It's not like you've earned anything. It's not like you've done anything. It's not like you've accomplished anything. All you've done is oppress people and lived off of them. Far from being, mighty and powerful, you're a parasite. So, so that's the fleeting pleasures of sin. The translation is the fleeting pleasures of sin. It's also translated temporary pleasures of sin. The word is used only in 4th Maccabees, which is part of the Septuagint, but isn't included in most Christian Bibles. I think it's included in possibly the Bible of the Syriac Orthodox Church. It's included in one of the 5 Eastern Orthodox churches, that split off sometime around after the Council of Nicaea. So, not the Greek Orthodox Church, not Catholic Church. There are 4 books of Maccabees. The 3rd and 4th books are included in some pre-Reformation faith traditions. But do you remember the mother and the 7 sons that are killed in First Maccabees?
Mhm.
So there are 7 sons, and the mother urges them to be martyred and watches them be martyred. And so Fourth Maccabees offers a kind of moral commentary about that. And it uses that phrase in Fourth Maccabees chapter 15, verse 8. It says, "Yet because of the fear of God, she disdained the temporary safety of her children rather. So the temporary safety would have been to keep them alive. The greater safety is to allow them to be martyred and receive an eternal reward from God." So there's a message here also for the author, for his audience, and in many ways for us as well. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. So clearly, one message is to not not abandon Christ, which is what he's urging his audience to do. Another is to look at your relationships in the world, look at your pleasures and the source of your pleasures, look at what you're tied to. Moses was tied to the court and chose to leave it. And so we're all tied living in a first world country, we're all tied to, particular pleasures, many of which come at the expense of either someone, some people, or some things. A great deal comes at the expense of our earth, which is, being depleted and being destroyed. So that's a relationship to be examined. Much of, the oppressive heavy labor, particularly in heavy industry, has shifted to the third world and to China, to Vietnam, to other countries where exploitation remains extremely intense. We profit from it and we don't see it. And so, it sort of doesn't affect us, but it affects others. And so we're involved in that nexus of oppressive relationships. And so those are things we always need to be aware of. And to the extent that we can do something about them, to do something about them.
So we're in the world, but we're not supposed to be of the world. Is that the expression?
Yeah.
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 I mean, we should always look at, the things of this world very, very critically and, you know, recognize good relationships from bad ones, recognize good practices from bad ones, recognize things that as people of faith, our role, what we should be doing is both instilling faith in others, ourselves being a model of Christ, and also working to improve the world, working to improve people, working to improve the environment, working to make sure that there are future generations. And you know, that's very much that's very concerning. You know, the rate of climate change, the destruction of our common home, you know, increased possibility of increased aggression throughout the world. All of those things. Moses chose to side with the oppressed, even though, you know, it cost him all of his privilege. He could have had a very nice life. And he, in fact, did have a very nice life, but he did that by faith. There was no guarantees, and he considered himself uniquely unqualified